Welcome to Value Plays Only, where Yawgmoth's will can't even loot Brain Freeze. Today we have John playing Ghave, Guru of Spores. This walking combo pile goes infinite with any 3 cards in the deck. This deck usually wins with an Aristocrat style loop or an Undying combo. His hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Agatha Soul Cauldron, Opposition Agent, Phyrexian Altar, Marsh Flats, Undergrowth Stadium, and a Bayou. Dan is playing Atraxa, Grand Unifier. This is a big mana food chain deck. It looks to ramp out its commander for massive value, winning with Thrasios Oracle or commander damage. His hand contains a Soul Ring, Enduring Vitality, the One Ring, Yawgmoth's Will, Bayou, Breeding Pool, and a Marsh Flats. Tyler's playing Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. This 5-color tutor chain has 0-card win lines it can tutor to the battlefield if it makes enough mana. In addition, it plays all the best value pieces 5 colors can offer. His hand contains an Eladamri's Call, Mox Amber, Silence, Colossal Sky Turtle, Nicol Bolas Dragon God, Scrubland, and Gemstone Caverns. Nick from the top deckers is playing Thrasios Triton Hero and Tymna the Weaver. This deck leverages 2 card advantage engines in the command zone to piece together either an infinite mana or Thrasios Oracle win. His hand contains a Lotho Corrupt Sheriff, Wan Shi Tong Librarian, Orcish Bowmasters, Elvish Spirit Guide, Neoform, Misty Rainforest, and Command Tower. And with that, let's see some value plays. Tyler has a pregame action, putting Gemstone Caverns into play, exiling Colossal Sky Turtle. John then starts things off with a City Ras, his land for turn. He casts an Esper Sentinel. John passes the turn. Dan plays a Marsh Flats, his land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up a Tundra. He casts a Soul Ring. Esper triggers and John draws. Dan then passes the turn. Tyler plays a Scrubland, his land for turn. He casts a Skrelv, Defector Might. He casts a Mox Amber. Esper triggers and he pays. Tyler then passes the turn. Nick plays a Misty Rainforest, his land for turn. He passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays a Bayou, his land for turn. He casts an Agatha Soul Cauldron. John goes to combat and swings Esper at Dan. He takes the damage, and John passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays an Exotic Orchard, his land for turn. Nick asks if Dan is planning to trigger Esper. Dan says definitely, and Nick says he has to play first. Dan passes priority to Nick, and he pays a life and cracks his Misty Rainforest, fetching up an Underground Sea. He exiles an Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand to cast Orcish Bowmasters. John begs him to reconsider, as Dan has tons of mana and hasn't tipped his hand yet. Nick is sure and Bowmasters enters and triggers, destroying Esper Sentinel. Dan then casts the One Ring. It resolves and Dan gains protection from everything. Dan taps the One Ring to draw a card. Bowmaster triggers to ping Skrelv for 1, killing it. Dan then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. He looks around at the shambles of his board and casts a main phase Eladamri's Call, searching up an Orcish Bowmasters of his own to hand. Tyler then passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He plays a Command Tower, his land for turn. He casts a Lotho Corrupt Sheriff. Nick goes to combat and swings his Orc Army at John. He takes the damage. Nick then passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays an Undergrowth Stadium, his land for turn. John passes the turn. Dan untaps and in his upkeep he takes 1 from the One Ring. He plays a Scalding Tarn, his land for turn. He pays life and cracks it. In response, John casts Opposition Agent. The table quiet down as Oppo resolves, and Dan goes into bargaining mode here. Nick says he would be willing to shoot the Opposition Agent with Bowmasters if Dan draws with his ring, but only if Dan plays 2 spells for Lotho. Dan says if he isn't blown out by this fetch, he can do that. Dan activates the One Ring to draw 2 cards. Bowmaster triggers twice, targeting Opposition Agent. In response, John activates Agatha's Soul Cauldron, exiling Skrelv to put a 1/1 counter on Oppo. It then takes 2 damage, and Dan's fetch resolves, controlled by John still. John looks at Dan's hand, and then fetches up a Tropical Island into exile. Dan then casts a Rhystic Study. He then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. He plays Boseiju, who endures, his land for turn. He casts an Orcish Bowmasters. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Bowmaster triggers to ping John for 1. Tyler's Bowmaster resolves and triggers to ping Nick's Bowmaster, killing it. Tyler then passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He takes no game actions and passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays Tropical Island from exile as land for turn. He casts Mana Vault. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Bowmaster triggers to ping Lotho, killing it. John then casts Smothering Tide. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Bowmaster pings Dan for 1. In response, Dan casts Swan Song, countering Tithe and giving John a 2/2 bird. Really worried about Dan's turn, John taps out for a Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Bowmaster pings Dan for 1. Nick shows Tyler a card and asks if he's good to resolve it to get back in the game a bit. Tyler says that's good for now, and Nick casts Wan Shi Tong, Librarian. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Bowmaster pings Dan for 1. John searches up a card to hand. Wan Shi Tong triggers to draw and get a counter. Bowmaster triggers to ping Dan for 1. John then passes the turn. Dan untaps and in his upkeep he takes 2 from the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, Tyler casts Silence. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Bowmaster pings him for 1. Dan responds with a Pact of Negation. Silence is countered and Dan moves to his main phase. He plays a Bayou, his land for turn. Dan casts a Culling Ritual. The table all pucker up as priority passes around. In an act of desperation, John activates Agatha's Soul Cauldron, exiling Lotho from Nick's grave to put a counter on Opposition Agent. Culling Ritual then resolves, blowing the board to bits and making Dan 4 black and 5 green mana. Dan casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Abrupt Decay. He activates the One Ring, drawing 3 cards. Dan casts Mnemonic Betrayal. It resolves and he gains access to all graveyards. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Mana Vault. He casts Wan Shitong, Librarian. He casts Smothering Tithe. Not seeing a win under Oppo, he opts to set up for his next turn. He casts Orcish Bowmasters from both Nick and Tyler's graves. Both enter and trigger, pinging John. He casts Esper Sentinel. He then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. Smothering Tithe triggers and Dan makes a treasure. He takes no game actions and passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. Tithe triggers and John shows Nick his whole hand to convince him to pay. John says if his hand resolves, Dan will lose to his pack trigger. Nick agrees and pays for Tithe. Nick then passes the turn. John untaps and in his upkeep, Nick casts Orim's Chant, targeting Dan. Rhystic and Esper trigger, and Dan draws 2. Amazingly, Orim's Chant resolves, locking Dan out of casting spells this turn. John draws and Tithe triggers to make a treasure. John plays Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, his land for turn. He casts his own Culling Ritual. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Dan looks at his board, back at his Pact to Negation, and passes Priority. Dan's board is blown back to bits, and John makes 3 black and 4 green mana. He casts his commander, Ghave, Guru of Spores. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. He casts a Birthing Pod. Rhystic triggers and Dan draws. Pod resolves, and John passes the turn. Dan untaps and in his upkeep, a Pact trigger and a One Ring trigger go on the stack. Dan takes 3, and then responds by activating the One Ring to draw 4. Looking at his massive hand, there's no out in sight. Pact to Negation resolves, and Dan can't pay and loses the game. The turn then moves to Tyler, who untaps and draws. He casts Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler. He activates the -2 ability of Tyvar to mill 3 and return Badgermole Cub to the battlefield. It triggers to Earthbend his Gemstone Caverns. Tyler passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Rhystic Study. It resolves and Nick passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays a Marsh Flats, his land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up a scrub land. He casts a Phyrexian Altar. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. Altar resolves. John activates Ghave to remove a counter from it and make a Saproling. He activates Birthing Pod to sacrifice his Saproling, searching up a Young Wolf to the battlefield. John sacrifices Young Wolf to Altar to make a mana. Undying triggers to return to the battlefield with a counter. He spends the mana through Ghave to remove a counter and make a Saproling. John presents a loop of sacrificing Young Wolf to Altar for mana and removing the counter it returns with to make a new Saproling. He uses this loop to make 10 million Saprolings. Thanks to Altar, he can also sacrifice his extra tokens to make infinite mana of all colors. He can also use Gave's ability to sacrifice some of his infinite tokens to make his creatures infinitely large. John ends up with a board of Ghave, Oppo, and 1 million Saprolings with 1 million +1/+1 counters each, and a lone Young Wolf. He casts Sylvan Library, paying for Rhystic. John then passes the turn with no cards in hand and a board of killer plants, daring his opponents to stop him. Tyler untaps and draws. He taps his land creature for mana to cast the Cabbage Merchant. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. He activates Tyvar to untap his Gemstone. Tyler then passes the turn. Nick untaps and draws. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Vial Smasher. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. With no outs in sight, the table accept their fate and pass to John. John untaps and goes to combat. He swings 5 million plants at Nick and Tyler, killing them by a country mile. And with that, John wins the game. Today, we have a 2-for-1 deal. In this game, Dan is again playing Atraxa, Grand Unifier. His hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Phantasmal Image, Drana and Linvala, Culling Ritual, Force of Will, Cavern of Souls, and Command Tower. Tyler is again playing Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. His hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Wan Shitong Librarian, Bloom Tender, Swords to Plowshares, Mountain Doom, Savannah, and Exotic Orchard. Nick is again playing Thrasios, Triton Hero, and Tymna the Weaver. His hand contains an Avacyn's Pilgrim, Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, the Cabbage Merchant, Swan Song, and Misty Rainforest. His Luna Mulligan is a Grand Abolisher. John is playing Malcolm, Keen-Eye Navigator, and Vial Smasher the Fierce. This Grixis Pirate deck looks to win fast. It can lean on Thassa's Oracle, Underworld Breach, Glinthorn Buccaneer, or a Trickery Charm Loop. His hand contains an Orcish Bowmasters, Mana Vault, Luxury Suite, and Command Tower. His 3 Luna Mulligans are Douthie Voidwalker, Bloodstained Mire, and Flooded Strand. And with that, let's see some value plays. Dan starts things off with a Command Tower, his land for turn. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He passes the turn. Tyler plays a Savannah, his land for turn. He casts his own Esper Sentinel. He passes the turn. Nick plays a Misty Rainforest, his land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up a Tropical Island. He casts a Mystic Remora, 2 Esper's trigger, and Tyler and Dan draw. He then passes the turn. John plays a Command Tower, his land for turn. He looks around at the 3 draw engines and looks back at his mold of 4. He decides to just pass the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays a Watery Grave, his land for turn. Into play untap, paying 2 life. He casts a Wishclaw Talisman. Esper and Mystic trigger, and Nick and Tyler draw. Dan then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. He plays a Wooded Foothills, his land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up a Tropical Island. He casts a Bloom Tender. Tyler goes to combat and swings Esper at Nick. Nick takes the damage, and Tyler passes the turn. Nick untaps and in his upkeep, he pays to keep Remora. He plays Gemstone Caverns, his land for turn. He passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He plays a luxury suite as land for turn. He once again just passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He plays a Flooded Strand as land for turn. He pays life and cracks it, fetching up a Tundra. He then activates Wishclaw Talisman, searching up a card in hand and giving Wishclaw to Tyler, on the promise that he'll pass it back. Dan then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. He plays a Command Tower as land for turn. He casts his commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. Tyler passes the turn. Nick untaps and in his upkeep he lets his reward die. He casts a Chrome Mox, both Esper's trigger, and in response John flashes in an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters and triggers to ping Gloomtender, killing it. In response to the rest of the triggers, Tyler says he can't live like this and casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Bowmasters. Esper triggers and he pays. Bowmaster is exiled and John gains 1. Tyler and Dan then draw from Espers. Chrome Mox then enters and imprints Avacyn's Pilgrim. Nick then taps out to cast the Cabbage Merchant. It resolves and he passes the turn. John untaps and draws. He casts a Mana Vault. Esper, and Cabbage Man trigger. Nick makes a food and Tyler and Dan draw. John then casts Jessica's Will, choosing Mana Mode, targeting Dan. Cabbage Man makes a food. John adds 8 red mana. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. Cabbage Man makes a food. In response, Dan casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling Phantasmal Image as an alternate cost. Esper and Cabbage Man trigger to make a food and draw a card. Wheel is countered over the sound of all John's cries. John then spends his remaining mana to cast a Glinthorn Buccaneer. The table's eyes go wide as John says this card isn't even good, as he was planning to discard it into his wheel. John then passes the turn with no cards remaining in hand. Dan untaps and draws. He plays a Cavern of Souls as land for turn, naming Angel as it enters. He casts Drana and Linvala. All 3 players look at their linchpin activated ability creatures as it resolves. Dan then passes the turn. Tyler untaps and draws. He plays a Guy's Cradle as land for turn. Tyler goes to combat, swinging Sisay at Nick. He takes the damage and Tyler passes the turn. In his end step, Nick taps his food to cast Enlightened Tutor. He can't actually do this under Drana and Linvala, but no one noticed until the next turn. 2 Espers trigger and Dan and Tyler draw. In response, Tyler casts Wan Shitong, Librarian, with X equals 2. It enters and triggers to draw. Enlightened Tutor then resolves, searching up a Wishclaw Talisman to the top of his library. Wan Shitong triggers to get a counter and draw. The turn then moves to Nick. Nick untaps and draws. He casts a Rhystic Study. 2 Espers trigger and Dan and Tyler draw. Nick then passes the turn. John untaps and in his draw step he takes 1 from Mana Vault. John takes no game actions and passes the turn. Dan untaps and draws. He casts a Dark Ritual. Esper, Cabbage Man, and Rhystic trigger. Nick draws, then makes a food, then Tyler draws. Dan adds 3 black mana and casts a Culling Ritual. Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger. Nick draws and makes a food. Culling Ritual resolves and blows the board to bits, making 6 black and 5 green mana. He casts his commander, Atraxa, Grand Unifier. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. Atraxa enters and triggers, revealing the top 10 and adding Verdant Catacombs, Mystic Remora, Chrome Mox, Pact of Negation, Mnemonic Betrayal, and Grand Abolisher to hand. Dan casts Chrome Mox, Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger. Nick draws and makes a food. It resolves and imprints Teferi, Time Raveler. Dan casts Mnemonic Betrayal, Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger to draw and make a food. Meanbet resolves and Dan has access to all the massive graveyards. He casts a Mana Vault, Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger to draw and make a food. He casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes targeting Nick. Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger to draw and make a food. In response, Dan casts an Enlightened Tutor, Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger to draw and make a food. Dan searches up a food chain at the top of his library, and then Jessica's Will makes 10 red mana and exiles Food Chain, Auto-War Soaring City, and Finale Devastation. Dan casts Food Chain from exile. Cabbage Man and Rhystic trigger. Dan pays, and Nick makes a food. Dan casts an Orcish Bowmasters from John's grave. Rhystic triggers and he pays. It enters and triggers to ping Nick for 1. Dan casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and in response, Dan exiles his Orc army to a food chain for a blue creature mana. Nick then draws and Bowmaster makes a new army and pings him for 1. Dan searches up a card to hand. Dan exiles Atraxa to food chain for 8 blue creature mana. He casts Mist Hollow Griffin. Rhystic triggers. Dan makes a mana from his Orc and then Nick draws. Bowmaster pings him for 1 and makes another army. Dan casts Grand Abolisher for some insurance, paying for Rhystic. He then casts Mockingbird with X equals 1, paying for Rhystic. It enters as a copy of Orcish Bowmasters, pinging Nick for 1. Dan is now free to present a loop of exiling Mist Hollow Griffin for 5 blue mana and recasting it for 4. Every time he does this, he nets a creature mana, but Nick gets a draw from Rhystic. Every time Nick draws, he's pinged for 2 from Bowmaster. Dan and Nick do this dance 17 or so times, while Nick desperately looks for a Spirit Guide and a Boseiju to stop the loop. He doesn't get there, and Nick dies. Dan then presents his loop of infinite mana of each color for creatures with Food Chain. He then casts his commander, Atraxa, over and over, exiling it with Food Chain until he's added every card in his deck to hand. He then casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters and triggers, and with no library remaining, Dan wins the game. So what did we learn today? Even if you have Esper, Bowman, Rhystic, Tithe the One Ring, Wan Shitong, and you manage to untap again, Culling Ritual can still end your life. If you have any tips for the video, leave them below. Subscribe if you feel like it. Until next time, keep making value plays. You know Dan's gonna cast the fucking One Ring.
Yeah.
And he's gonna get away with murder. He literally doesn't give me a draw and he gets whatever he fucking wants.
You can cast the One Ring?
You know he is.
Dude, he loves that card.
Dude, I'm telling you, like, you're like, oh, let's prevent the Abzan pile from getting 1 draw, so Atraxa can do whatever the fuck he wants with 4 mana.
He can tap it now, I can kill the Screv.
Yeah, great. Dan, you get protection. Fuck you! I hate you.
We're teammates.
Dan, that was premeditated. You don't feel bad. You're mad you got caught.
Premeditated. I wasn't mad. You know what? I'm gonna tap it.
Dude, shoot Dan in the head.
It's protection.
Shoot the bug. Sorry, bug.
Yo, good starts, Tyler, me and you.
And I will pass there.
I'm gonna fucking murder Dan.
Dude, I know. He's getting away with whatever the fuck he
annoying.
wants. 3, like, we're always under the Bowmaster. However, the cool 2 brothers want it.
Yeah, the
Dan gets all the cards he wants, and his fucking henchman is gonna blow us to bits.
I have no connection.
He just does things to help me. I don't know what to tell you.
Shooting my business.
Would you not kill my guys? With your
I'm
bow
definitely
guys?
shooting your bowman. As a fucking creature combo deck, I can't live under that. No.
Yeah. Dan, you want to tap into response your fetch?
Yeah.
I'll kill if you let me get a Lotho trigger.
Dan, am I good to resolve your fetch and see your new hand?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, brother.
There you go.
I'm telling you, you should have just let him have
The free
land,
gift pro.
Oh!
and we could have.
What do you
God
think?
dang it. Well, he drew a bunch of counters. Yeah, I am worried about my old friend Dan now.
I got nothing.
Dude, you said you can out Oppo.
Dude, it just goes back to when we were.
I know he has Mind Break Trap and Imp Seal.
When you said,
and he
Dan,
has a ton of lands.
there's 10 times when I've seen you on camera where you're like, I got nothing.
Okay,
I
you know
can't
what?
win.
You know what? I'm gonna do well on my turn.
Yeah.
Is that what you want to hear?
You little shithead. I got nothing.
I got nothing.
I mean, you have to tell me I'm ripping this Ristic Study. I mean, I'm not gonna.
Dan will lose the game if this
What's
resolves.
a we win the game?
He
I
literally
know.
loses to his pack trigger if this resolves. He doesn't have 5 mana if everything is
1,
gone.
2, 3. Oh,
He's 3 fucking
I
lands.
understand. All right, let's team up for a little bit. We need that to resolve, correct?
Yep. Fucking love that. Yeah. Fucking him.
What?
Go ahead and cast it.
So in your main phase,
Yep, I'll pass
I'm
priority.
going to cast Orange Chant on you, Dan.
Current player can't cast spells.
Okay.
This is so awesome. Dan, with all of your power, you never asked if you could.
He has to counter this.
Yeah, no, I
and, like,
agree.
yeah.
No, you're the strongest man I know.
I can't even counter it. That's for sure.
Wow, does it resolve?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Alright, he's
it's all-
silenced.
Wow. Okay. I will put a culling ritual on the stack. Title of this video is back-to-back culling writ equals good.
Yeah.
my god. So
I
next
got 10
turn-
million guys who are each 10 million, and I'm passing. Let's see if I win.
So next turn you just beat us.
I'm
Yeah, I got
just
you.
gonna go. I have no cards in hand. I'm gonna go to combat. Pass.
You little shitter.
You're a G.
Dude.
Bro, I'm fucking not. No, fuck you guys. You deserve my draws. No. I hate you.
Mold it too.
Tired of all these 7s with their draw engines looking down on my 4. I literally wasn't even going to cast it. I was trying to wheel it away. I could have cast it first with the red, and I thought, not even worth it. Not even worth making myself a threat. I should just fucking wheel it.
Dan, kill him.
I will pass that.
I've lost for
ability,
the
right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna say
Oh,
activate the
God,
ability.
that's
This is
so,
this is on Angel.
I've lost for probably the 4th time in 2 turns. That's crazy.
Oh, shit. Dude,
Have you
activate
passed
Sisay.
You haven't won, but I've lost. Man, guys, I'm sorry that my mold of 4 had such powerful cards in it.
Dude,
The
it's
one
all
meme
good.
that wins the game. It's crazy. Bowman, Wheel, J-Will.
I know, that
Man of
Bowman
all.
set me back. Both games, Bowman has set me back so
I went-
hard.
Come on, give me a hand. Give it a
Press
try.
7, press 7.
Guess Wheel with double Bowmaster.
There you go. We'll do that.
Honestly, that would have won also.
Yeah. Alright, Dan.